Welcome to Logic and Dialogue. I'm Sam.
And I'm Ari.
Before we dive into today's topic, I have to ask, did you see that documentary on ancient astronomy last night?
I didn't, but let me guess. They mentioned how the Presocratics contributed to early astronomical thought.
Exactly, and it was fascinating to see how many of their ideas, though primitive by today's standards, were remarkably innovative for their time, which brings us perfectly to today's topic.
Oh, I see what you did there. Smooth transition. We're exploring pre-Socratic philosophy today, those thinkers who came before Socrates and laid the groundwork for Western philosophical thought.
That's right. If you're enjoying the show so far, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We're exploring profound philosophical ideas through these conversations, and we'd love to have you join us for future episodes.
And don't forget to send your comments and topic requests to logicanddialogue@gmail.com. We love hearing from our listeners.
So, pre-Socratics, let's start with the basics. Who were they and why do they matter?
The Presocratics were a group of thinkers from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, primarily from ancient Greek colonies. Despite the name, some were actually contemporaries of Socrates, but they're grouped together because they represent a particular approach to understanding the world that preceded the Socratic turn toward ethical questions.
And they're often considered the first philosophers and scientists in the Western tradition, right?
Exactly. Though calling them philosophers is somewhat anachronistic, they wouldn't have used that term themselves. The word philosopher, as we understand it today, really came into its own with Plato and Aristotle.
That's a good point. So, what were they doing if not philosophy in the modern sense?
They were inquirers into nature, what the Greeks called physiologoi. They were asking fundamental questions about the world. What is everything made of? How does change occur? What's the relationship between appearance and reality?
And what made their approach different from what came before?
That's where it gets really interesting. Before the Presocratics, explanations of natural phenomena typically invoked the gods. Think of Hesiod's theogony, where the world forms through a succession of divine births and conflicts.
Right. Zeus swallows his pregnant wife Metis to prevent his children from overthrowing him, and in the process gains her attribute of wisdom. It's a mythological explanation.
Exactly. By contrast, the Presocratics sought natural explanations. They viewed the cosmos as an ordered system that could be understood through observation and reason, not through appeals to divine intervention.
Which is pretty revolutionary when you think about it.
Absolutely. They initiated a fundamental shift in how humans understood their world. They were the first to suggest that beneath the apparent chaos and diversity of nature, there might be some underlying order or principle that could be grasped by human reason.
Let's talk about some of the major figures. I think many people have heard of Thales predicting an eclipse, even if that story might be apocryphal.
Thales of Miletus is traditionally considered the first Western philosopher. Around 600 BC, he proposed that water was the fundamental principle or arche of everything.
Wait, water? Like literally everything is made of water?
It's not entirely clear if he meant everything literally is water in different forms or if water was just the originating source. Aristotle suggests Thales might have chosen water because it's essential for life, nutrition, and growth.
And he was from Miletus, which makes him part of the Milesian school, right?
Yes, the Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes were all from Miletus in what's now Turkey. They shared this approach of looking for a fundamental principle underlying all things, though they disagreed about what it was.
So if Thales said water, what did the others propose?
Anaximander suggested something he called the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite. He thought it couldn't be any specific element, but was rather an unlimited, eternal substance from which all particular things emerge and to which they return.
That's a much more abstract concept than just water.
It is, and Anaximenes went back to something more concrete, air. He thought air could transform into different things through condensation and rarefaction. When air is condensed, it becomes water, then earth, then stone. When rarefied, it becomes fire.
I'm noticing a pattern here. It seems like they were all monists, believing in one fundamental substance.
Good observation. The Milesians were indeed material monists in that sense. But the pre-Socratic tradition gets more complex as it develops. Let me ask you this. If everything is ultimately one substance, how do you explain change?
That's a tough one. I guess change would have to be some kind of rearrangement or transformation of that one substance.
That's exactly the problem later pre-Socratics grappled with, and it leads us to one of the most influential figures in this tradition, Parmenides of Elea.
Parmenides. What is and what is not is not. That guy?
The very same. Parmenides made a radical argument that genuine change is impossible. If something comes into being, it must come either from what is or from what is not. It can't come from what is because then it already exists. And it can't come from what is not because nothing comes from nothing.
So his conclusion is that change is an illusion?
Essentially, yes. For Parmenides, reality must be eternal, unchanging, and unified. What we perceive as change and plurality is just appearance, not reality.
That's a pretty mind-bending position. Did anyone try to defend our everyday experience of change?
Absolutely. Later, Presocratics like Empedocles and Anaxagoras accepted Parmenides' logical arguments, but found creative ways to reconcile them with observable change.
How did they manage that?
Empedocles proposed that there are four eternal roots: earth, air, fire, and water, that combine and separate under the influence of two cosmic forces he called love and strife. Nothing truly comes into being or passes away. There's just mixing and separating of these eternal elements.
That sounds like a pluralist position rather than monism.
Exactly. It's a post-Parmenidean pluralism that preserves the Eleatic insight that what fundamentally exists cannot come into being or pass away, while still accounting for apparent change.
And what about Anaxagoras? Didn't he have something to do with mind organizing the cosmos?
Yes, Anaxagoras proposed that all things contain portions of everything else, everything is in everything, but in different proportions. And he introduced nous, or mind, as a cosmic force that initiated the rotation and separation of this original mixture.
I'm starting to see why these thinkers were so revolutionary. They were developing sophisticated metaphysical systems to explain the world without resorting to mythology.
Before we move on, we should definitely mention the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus. They proposed that reality consists of tiny indivisible particles, atoms, moving in a void.
By convention sweet and by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, in reality atoms and void. That's Democritus, right?
Impressive, quote, recall. Yes, that's Democritus, suggesting that all qualities we perceive are just conventions resulting from different arrangements of atoms. It's a remarkably modern sounding perspective.
Hey listeners, if you're enjoying our deep dive into pre-Socratic thought, make sure to subscribe to Logic and Dialogue. And remember, you can send your thoughts and questions to logicanddialogue@gmail.com.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about these pre-Socratics primarily as natural philosophers or proto-scientists, but they had broader interests too, right?
Definitely. Take Heraclitus, for instance. He's famous for "you cannot step into the same river twice," suggesting everything is in flux.
Yes, though that's probably a later paraphrase. What Heraclitus actually said was more like, on those stepping into rivers, staying the same, other and other waters flow.
Always the stickler for precision.
Well, it matters. Heraclitus wasn't just saying everything constantly changes. He was pointing to a unity underlying apparent opposites and change. For him, the cosmos operates according to a rational principle he called the logos.
And he had that wonderful line about nature loving to hide, right?
Nature loves to hide. Yes. Heraclitus thought that the truth about reality isn't immediately apparent to the senses, but requires deep thought and interpretation.
It strikes me that we're seeing two competing tendencies here. Parmenides emphasizing unchanging being accessible to reason alone, and Heraclitus emphasizing constant flux, but with an underlying rational order.
That's a great observation. And this tension between being and becoming, between unity and plurality, between what reason tells us and what experience shows us, these become recurring themes throughout the history of Western philosophy.
Let's not forget Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans. There's more to them than the theorem about right triangles, right?
Much more. The Pythagoreans developed a philosophical religious movement centered on the idea that reality is fundamentally mathematical. All things are number, as they reportedly said.
And they had some strange practices too, like not eating beans.
They did have various dietary and lifestyle restrictions as part of their philosophical religious practice. They also believed in the transmigration of souls, that the soul is immortal and is reborn in different bodies.
Which reminds me, Empedocles also had something similar, right? He claimed to be a fallen god who had been incarnated in various forms.
Yes, Empedocles combined cosmological theories with spiritual teachings. He allegedly threw himself into Mount Etna to prove his divinity.
Career commitment right there. What about the sophists? Do they count as pre-Socratics?
The sophists are sometimes included in discussions of pre-Socratic thought, although they represent a shift toward human concerns rather than cosmology. Figures like Protagoras, with his man is the measure of all things, and Gorgias, who argued against the possibility of certain knowledge. raised important questions about knowledge and language.
It seems like by the time we get to the Sophists, we're moving toward the Socratic interest in ethics and human affairs.
Exactly. The shift from the early Presocratics to the Sophists and then to Socrates represents a gradual turning from questions about the natural world to questions about human beings and how we should live.
So, what's the legacy of pre-Socratic philosophy? Why should our listeners care about these ancient thinkers?
Well, first, they established the fundamental problems and approaches that would define Western philosophy. The questions they asked about the nature of reality, change, knowledge, and being remain central philosophical questions today.
And they pioneered the idea that the world is intelligible through human reason, which is foundational for both philosophy and science.
Absolutely, they were the first to suggest that beneath the apparent chaos of experience, there might be an underlying order that human beings can comprehend through rational inquiry.
Plus, they established different approaches to philosophical problems that continue to shape how we think. Some emphasized empirical observation, others abstract reasoning. Some sought unity, others acknowledged plurality.
And they did this without institutional support or an established tradition to build on. They were creating a new way of thinking from scratch.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. These thinkers from small Greek colonies, working with limited information and no scientific instruments, initiated an intellectual revolution that we're still building on today.
I think that's what makes studying the Presocratics so rewarding. They remind us that profound philosophical thinking doesn't require fancy terminology or extensive background knowledge, just a willingness to ask fundamental questions and follow the arguments wherever they lead.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our exploration of pre-Socratic philosophy.
I hope our listeners have enjoyed this journey to the origins of Western philosophical thought.
Remember to subscribe to Logic in Dialogue on your favorite podcast platform and follow us on social media to stay updated on future episodes.
And don't forget, we love hearing from you. Send your questions, comments, and topic suggestions to logicindialogue@gmail.com.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep the dialogue going.
See you next time on Logic and Dialogue.